How would my settings in OBS turn off my microphone? Anyway, it is Thursday, and we're doing Gaslight Mysteries, or Beyond Baker Street. I have not really decided on a title. I think officially I have it as listed as Beyond Baker Street. But tonight we are working in Volume 2 of Rivals of Sherlock Holmes. So, should be interesting stories. In fact, I think tonight, the second story might actually be an author Conan Doyle. Look, just to make sure. Okay, we've got one more from Guy Clifford. Yep. 3 stories after that from Arthur Conan Doyle. Cool. Anyway, let's see, it's 9:08, so we've got a little bit longer to go. Guess I could actually announce that I'm streaming on Twitter. Of course, I'm not the only one on. I did actually do a game stream earlier today. I was playing some Baldur's Gate, which was fun. I feel like I need to do more game streams. Just because, well, everyone else streams games. And, you know, I enjoy playing games. I don't know why I'm not streaming any. Okay, let's see if I can get this done. Okay. Okay, that's on. Get YouTube Studio back up. Get it so I can see chat in 2 different windows. And then I guess we'll get into our first story. I wonder how hard it would be to make a book stand. Like, because honestly, my hand's been falling asleep lately. Probably not a good thing. Anyway. Give me 1 minute. I gotta do something real quick. I had to blow my nose and I didn't want to blow up people's ears. Aren't I nice? Anyway, our first story for tonight. Make sure I've got the page ready. Okay. The Wendall Bank Case by Guy Clifford. I believe few professions see so much of the seamy side of life as do solicitors in active practice. Some clergymen in the poorest and lowest districts of our great cities are no doubt oftener brought in contact with the sufferers from keen poverty and its contaminants, drink and debauchery. But this class is only one of many that comes under the heading I have in mind. The medical brotherhood, too, have curious and saddening experience amongst the poorer patients, but to the lawyer is opened out a larger field, embracing all sorts of conditions of men, from the most wretched pilferer to the high-class rogue. The peculiar case which has brought these thoughts uppermost in my mind may be recognized by some who peruse the story, but in order to avoid unnecessary pain, I shall omit the real names of the chief actors of these scenes. Among our most lucrative and esteemed clients was Josiah Wendall, the head of a well-known firm of private bankers of Wendall, Holmes and Company. When Mr. Wendall walked into my room early one morning, some years ago, I noticed immediately that some matter of serious importance was troubling him. There was no jovial salutation, as was his wont, but instead his face bore the impression of grief and sorrow. Without preamble he commenced, as he sat down by my side. "Mr. Walton, I am sorely upset and want your advice. Not so much professionally as privately, as a friend." I expressed my sympathy in a few words and waited for him to proceed. Mr. Wendall was a rich man, and his affairs, I had ample knowledge of knowing, were prosperous and thriving, so I did not attribute his worry to any money matters. "I scarcely know how to commence," began Mr. Wendall, "for my story inculpates without a shadow of a doubt one whom I have always looked upon as a soul of honor, and who has endeared to me as much of his own good qualities as also for his father's sake. Even now, with every circumstance pointing to his guilt, I cannot believe him criminal. However, I will give you the facts so far as they are known, and then, perhaps, we may find some opening to work with. You're aware, Mr. Holton, that my nephew, Frank Wendall, holds the responsible position of chief cashier in our bank." I signified my assent to the question, and he continued. "Now, as such, he has the right to enter the safe room during business hours. This right is also enjoyed by the manager and myself and my partner Holmes, and no one else is ever permitted to go into that room save the 4 persons I have just named. As it happens, the manager is away on his holiday, and before he left Saturday, the cash, notes, and other securities were checked, and all were correct, so that we can leave him out of the affair, which is now narrowed down to 3 persons. Yesterday, after the doors were closed, my books were made up, and the cash and notes checked in the usual way, when it was discovered that £3,000 in notes were missing." "Excuse me a moment," I interrupted, "but are they still unaccounted for?" My client seemed rather surprised at the question, for he answered somewhat evasively, "Yes, of course, or I shouldn't have been troubling you." At his reply, I rang my bell and desired the clerk who answered it to ask my partner, Robert Graceman, to come to my room if he was in. While he was gone with his message, I explained to Mr. Wendell that I thought Mr. Graceman's advice on such a serious matter would be far more valuable than mine. While I was speaking, Graceman came in, and these two old friends greeted each other warmly. "How's my little godchild Trixie?" asked Robert Graceman. The smile of welcome passed away from Mr. Wendell's brow at the question, and he replied gravely, "I'm afraid, Graceman, that the news you will soon have to hear will break her heart." Beatrice, or Trixie as she was just called, was Josiah Wendell's only child, and the apple of his eye. The fact that my partner, Robert Graceman, had stood godfather over her shows the terms of friendship which had existed between the two men for many years. At the serious and, to ask him, strange reply of his friend, Graceman turned to me with the remark, "What's the matter?" "Tell him, Alton," said Mr. Wendell. So I repeated, shortly and as concisely as possible, the opening incidents I had just heard. As the elucidation of the disappearance of the notes and the final result of the affair passed hereafter through Graceman's hands, I set down the rest of the story and narrative as the various details were unraveled. "What has all this got to do with Trixie?" asked Graceman. "Although I have no authority in saying so beyond my own common sense tells me, yet I am sure that Frank and Trixie look upon each other with more affection than their cousinly relationship might justify," replied Mr. Wendell. "What does Frank say to the loss of the notes?" was Graceman's next inquiry. "He can give no explanation. He is as much in the dark as the rest of us," replied Frank's uncle. "When the loss was discovered, and it was first naturally assumed to be a mistake in the counting, but after repeatedly checking no alteration could be made, and Frank sent one of the clerks up to my house, for whilst he remained with those of the clerks who had been engaged with him. When I received his message, I hurried back to the bank, and we had all the business done since the last checking gone through. But still there remained the unaccountable discrepancy of £3,000. Frank then suggested we should examine the contents of the safe and hope that the packet of notes might have fallen down somewhere, so he and a couple of the other clerks emptied the room whilst I looked on. As each bag of corn or package with notes was returned, they were carefully and anxiously scanned, but we had our trouble for nothing. No one could suggest anything further. We locked up for the night, leaving the watchman in charge." "This is a bad business, Wendell," he began. "A very bad business." Now, Holmes, as a rule, is an easygoing fellow. In fact, too easygoing, as I have sometimes hinted to him. But it struck me somehow that there was more feeling in his words than the occasion at present called for. I suppose my surprise at his manner showed itself, for he went on. "It appears that the books and cash were checking over and over again last night, and the £3,000 is still missing. Well, notes don't walk away by themselves, and unless someone broke into the safe room, of which there is no appearance or suggestion, they must have been, well, to speak plainly, stolen." It was speaking plainly with a vengeance, yet still there was no other way to accounting for their loss. Then he continued, "This cannot be hushed up, for it affects the heads of the bank too seriously, for there are only 3 people who have free entrance to the safe room, you, myself, and your nephew Frank Wendell. Under the circumstances, I'm sure you will agree with me that the fullest investigation only will suffice, and the sooner the matter is put into the proper hands, the better for all of us." For a few moments I pondered over what Holmes had so clearly reasoned, and I could find no fault in his argument. Somehow I felt that Frank was not the culprit, and if this were so, there remains but Holmes and myself, and I should soon expect to be charged with the theft myself, his dream of suspecting Holmes. Altogether, Holmes says it's very unpleasant business. Have you called anyone into the investigation? Asked Graceman. No, I suggested to Holmes that I should ask your advice as to what we should do, and he consented immediately on consulting you. For a few seconds, Graceman remained in thought. Then he said, I quite agree with Mr. Holmes that the matter should be gone into without further delay, and if you consent, I will send a note up to Scotland Yard at once and put the affair into Inspector Lehman's hands. He is a cautious, careful man, and you don't want the matter made more public at present than can be helped. Meantime, I should advise you to call your official accountants and have your books authentically audited so that you can make absolutely sure that there is no other way of explaining the loss. So Mr. Wendall went back to his bank, and a note was sent up to the Inspector Lehman by special messenger, and in due time that official came down to her office. After he and Graceman had discussed the matter of the facts so that they had so far, they went together around to the bank. I am very glad to meet you, Mr. Graceman, said Mr. Holmes when they entered. My opinion is that the sooner the affair of this kind is put into the proper hands, the better for everyone. Then they proceeded to the safe room to see themselves where the notes were stolen from, and Inspector Lehman minutely examined the lock for evidence of tampering. There was no indication, however small, to show that the safe had been forced, so after a short while they met again in the partner's private room. Safe has not been broken into, gentlemen, remarked the officer authoritatively, and then he proceeded. I understand that only two gentlemen, looking alternatively between Mr. Wendall and his partner, and your chief inspector, and your chief cashier, Mr. Frank Wendall, were allowed to enter the safe room. Yes, that is so, answered Mr. Wendall. Is it impossible for either of the other clerks to enter the safe? Asked Mr. Lehman. Mr. Holmes glanced at his partner, who returned the look of inquiry when the former replied, It is not possible to enter it, and I believe it would be impossible for others of the clerks or anyone else to enter without being observed. And that is really what you meant? Yes, sir, that is my meaning, answered the inspector. But how do you arrange that no one can enter unseen? Is there always someone watching the safe? Let me explain, said Mr. Holmes. You saw that the safe stood apart from clear of the clerks' desks, with a large space between it and the nearest desk. Mr. Lehman answered with the affirmative, and Mr. Holmes then continued. Our strictest injunction and most sternly enforced rule is that no clerk shall approach or enter the safe room unless specifically requested, and is accompanied by one of the partners, the manager, or the chief cashier. The penalty of this breach of the rule is instant dismissal, without appeal. Another rule, equally stringent, obliges any clerk or any other official to report at once anyone infringing on this rule, and to call the attention of those in the office to the offender, to corroborate his breach with those regulations. The desks facing the safe room set 20 clerks, and I would say that it would be absolutely impossible for anyone to enter the safe without being observed. I quite endorse Mr. Holmes's opinion, added his partner. I do not believe the safe could be entered by anyone without being noticed. Very well, gentlemen, replied the inspector. You, of course, are aware that the only inference can be drawn from your opinions is that your chief cashier must have abstracted the notes, and I should like to have a few words with him if you will allow me to do so. Scarcely had the inspector formulated his wish ere Mr. Holmes rang his bell and requested Mr. Frank Wendall to be sent to them. You have a private room I can see him in? Asked the officer. Certainly, Mr. Holmes, he answered. And then Frank answered and said, This is Mr. Frank Wendall, Inspector Layman. Then turning to Frank, he continued, Your uncle and I have considered that it is advisable to transfer our personal responsibilities to the proper authority and this gentleman, waving his hand towards the officer, desires to have a few words with you. Take him into the next room. Inspector Layman closed the door carefully and, approaching quite closely to Frank, said, I presume we cannot be overheard in any way. I think not, answered Frank rather shortly, for he did not quite appreciate the position. Circumstantial facts pointed very inflexibly at himself as a thief, and he knew that unless the notes were discovered, the odium and shame would surely rest on him, whether or not Mr. Holmes or his uncle charged him openly. Knowing himself innocent, he had hitherto refrained from supposing that the notes were stolen, for the simple reason that he hadn't taken them, and there were only two other persons who could, namely his uncle or Mr. Holmes, neither of whom, for the moment, had thought capable. Frank's notion was that by some strange mischance the notes had gotten mislaid. How or where he hadn't the slightest idea. All this had been carrying through his puzzled brain ever since the notes were proved to be gone. Inspector Layman noticed the abruptness of Frank's reply and receded. Do not consider me an enemy, Mr. Wendall, simply because I am an officer and have unpleasant questions. Frank reddened somewhat at the implied rebuke, and then, with his usual outspokenness, he said, I beg your pardon, of course. You are only doing your duty. Now, fire away. Ask me anything you like. Meanwhile, pray sit down. And Frank drew a chair forward for the inspector, while he sat himself in a corner of the table. First of all, can you give me the numbers of the missing notes? Said the inspector. Frank drew a slip of paper from his pocket and handed it to Mr. Layman. It contained the numbers of the notes, which were all of the value of £10 each. Good, replied the officer, as he glanced over the slip, and then added, What is your opinion of the missing notes? Are they lost, mislaid, stolen, or what? At first, of course, I thought they were mislaid somehow, but that seems impossible now after the searches we've made. Then comes the question of theft and the thieves. And then Frank went over to the same rules that Mr. Holmes had previously enumerated. So you see that if they were stolen, there are three possible thieves, myself, my uncle, and Mr. Holmes. Have you any reason to think your uncle or Mr. Holmes guilty? Interrogated Mr. Layman, holding up a warning finger as Frank sprang off the table. Frank choked down the hasty words of denial he was about to utter, and reseated himself in the corner and answered quietly, No, not the slightest suspicion. Ejaculated the officer, looking squarely at Frank, who returned his gaze unflinching, and then added, I don't know whether that home of yours was a question or not, but I may remark that I have not taken any notes. I believe you, Mr. Wendell, answered the officer in a tone of sincerity. Then he said, Now, for my last question, why does Mr. Holmes dislike you? Dislike me? Asked Frank in amazement. I was not aware that he did. Certainly we have never been particularly cordial with each other, but he is a standoffish man with all the clerks. No, I think you're mistaken, Mr. Layman. Well, perhaps I am. No doubt it's only his manner. Rising from his seat, he thanked Frank for his confidence, and returned to the room where the partners and Graceman were still busy turning over the details of the loss. Well, asked Mr. Holmes interrogatively, as the detective entered. Mr. Frank Wendall did not account for the loss, the lady replied. He practically confirms every point that you have admitted. What do you propose now that be done? Asked Mr. Holmes. For a few moments, the astute officer did not reply. Then he said, "I should like to consider the case for a short time, say until tomorrow morning. Then I will give you my opinion. That is, unless you prefer to charge your cashier with theft at once." "No, no," exclaimed Mr. Wendell. "Frank is no thief." "Very well, gentlemen. I will call in the morning." Mr. Graceman rose as the inspector bowed himself out. In a low tone, he said to the two partners, "I will go with him and hear what he thinks on the matters." As the lawyers and detective walked slowly away, Mr. Graceman opened the conversation abruptly with, "Is Frank Wendell the thief, Layman?" "I believe not," was the answer. "He is in a terribly bad hole. I suppose there's no doubt the notes were there." "They all say so," replied Mr. Graceman. Then he added, "Let me jot down the numbers of those notes." And the officer handed him the slip to the companion, which he rapidly copied and then required. "Now I must leave you, Layman," said Robert Graceman, as they reached the corner of the street. And then, as though it was an afterthought, he added that they should shake hands. "I'm rather interested in this little affair, and perhaps shall be able to offer you a few suggestions when the thoughts you riddle out. But then again, I may be working on the wrong scent. So you go ahead with your own deductions, and if I come across anything of importance, you shall hear from me." And so they parted. The detective officer returned to his office, and by breakfast time next morning had the reports and notes from several of his staff, who he had specifically detailed to glean information likely to help. Frank Wendell's private address had been watched, and his movements dogged during the past few hours. His uncle and Mr. Holmes had also shared a part of the careful inspector's attention, but so far nothing of importance had been unearthed by the bloodhounds of Scotland Yard. Frank had gone home to his rooms in Russell Square rather late than usual, having had another turn at the books at the bank. He had his dinner and then walked up Oxford Street to Hyde Park and entered his uncle's house, which he left about 10:30 and walked back to his lodgings. Mr. Wendell, Frank's uncle, had gone home direct from the bank early in the afternoon, and had not since left his house. Mr. Holmes, however, had dined with his club, visited one of the theaters, and caught the last train to Waterloo for Richmond, where he resided in a bachelor estate. "Precious little help to me here," muttered the detective as he threw down the various reports of the satellites. "I don't like Mr. Holmes," he soliloquized. "But that's mere prejudice, of course. There's no motive for his stealing the notes, unless... By George, I never thought of that." And Mr. Layman hastily rose up and put on his hat and hurried out. The bank had just opened when the detective arrived, and Frank Wendell was busily engaging in opening and reading the ordinary business correspondence in his private room when the inspector was announced. "Early, Mr. Layman," remarked Frank, looking up. "Have you any good news?" His visitor shook his head negatively, but instead of answering the question, asked another. "Can you inform me if either your uncle or Mr. Holmes is pressed for money?" "No, don't get angry. There may be nothing in the inquiry. And if it is a breach of confidence, why, you can please yourself to answer no. But in the latter event, it would necessitate my finding out through other sources, which might be still less to the liking of the partners." Frank sat for a moment in his thoughts, and rapidly examining the motive for the detective's question. The inspector saw his advantage and followed up in a masterly manner. "Don't forget, sir," he said quietly, "that I have been instructed to investigate this unfortunate affair, and that your position is seriously and gravely threatened if the missing notes are not soon discovered." "You shall see the accounts of my uncle and Mr. Holmes as they stand in the firm's ledger," Frank replied at last, and without further parley he went to the outer office and brought in the bank ledger. Turning up the account first to his uncle, there appeared a godly balance at the gentleman's credit. Then Mr. Holmes's account was found. "I thought he had more than that," muttered Frank, as the figures totted out to show only a few £100 balance. "Still, this is only his private account, and he appears to have been drawing on it pretty frequently lately. Perhaps he's investing it. I see a good many checks are payable to Scott and Son. Those are stockholders." "Yes, very likely," answered Mr. Lehman. "And now, to complete my curiosity, let me see your account." As the detective made his demand, he glanced keenly at the young man by his side. Frank turned over the leaves rapidly and without hesitation pointed his finger to the columns which represented his own little account. Then he remarked with a smile, "I am sorry it's so small, but I rely on your reticence not to publish my poverty to the world." "You may rely on my treating your confidence with absolute secrecy," replied his companion, and then he bade him good morning, saying he should return to see his uncle later on. But his morning's work had not yet discovered any new feature of the tangled skein which had been placed in his hands for solution, and when Inspector Lehman, a few hours later, presented himself before the two partners, he had practically nothing new to report. "We must wait until some of the stolen notes turn up," was his last remark as he left the room. "There's nothing to work on," mused the puzzled detective as he made his way thoughtfully towards the city, where he proposed to drop into the Bank of England on the off chance of finding some of the missing notes had been cashed. All of the banks in London and the country had been notified of the loss, with the numbers of the notes. There was no news of them yet, however, so Mr. Lehman hailed a hansom and got back to his official quarters to attend to other business. On the third day after his visit to the city, Inspector Lehman received a telegram just as he was leaving to get his frugal lunch. It was from Robert Graceman, and he was dispatched to the Royal Hotel Hall. The message was short, but the detective seemed thunderstruck at its contents. Then he read it through again. "Bring warrant for arrest of Charles Farnley, Wendall's manager, for the theft of £3,000 notes. It is detained here." "Well, he muttered. Early that night, Inspector Lehman arrived at Hull, and Mr. Graceman met him at the station. "Have you got your papers?" said Mr. Graceman, as they shook hands. Lehman nodded, and then he could hold his patience no longer. "How on earth did you trace it to him?" he exclaimed. "Where did you find your clue?" "Wait till we've got him safe under lock and key, then you can hear all the details," replied his companion, as they walked briskly towards the police station, which was only a few minutes away. Charles Farnley was detained on suspicion, and as soon as Inspector Lehman arrived with his warrants, the prisoner was transferred to the secure custody of a police cell. "Come on, Mr. Grayson," Lehman began, directly as they got back to the hotel, and had secured a quiet corner in the smoking room. "How did you get on his tail?" "Let me ask you first, Lehman," said Robert Graceman. "You were present when Mr. Frank Wendall checked the contents of the safe for our edification. Did you notice the method in which it was done?" The inspector looked at his questioner as though he could read from the latter's face what he was driving at. At last he slowly replied, "Yes, I believe I remember. Mr. Frank took the packages of notes and bags and coins from one clerk, who called out each, and glancing at them, placed them in the safe." "Quite so," replied Mr. Graceman approvingly. Then he continued, "Our friend here, Mr. Farnley, went through the operation on the previous checking just before he went away." "Yes," said the inspector, still in the dark. "Therefore, assuming that neither Mr. Wendall, the uncle, or Mr. Holmes, or Mr. Wendall, the nephew, had touched the notes since then, Mr. Farnley was the last person to do so." "Ah!" ejaculated the detective. "That sets you to thinking about the manager." Just so, and then I casually inquired where our friend had gone on his holiday, and it was told to Scarborough. Now, Scarborough, at this period of the year, he's a bit no. Now, Scarborough, at this period of the year, was, so I thought, hardly a place for a man of Finley's lively temperament, for he's a bit of a masher in his way, and it is dead out of season for that lively seaside resort. I ascertained from Mr. Wendall, on a quiet, what hotel he was staying at, and as I knew you would attend the matters in London all right, I considered the air of Scarborough might do me some good, so I caught the afternoon train for that charming place. Then the hospitality exclaimed, and he proffered a cigar. Have another cigar. Yours is out. Thank you, replied Inspector Lehman, judiciously hiding his impatience to hear the rest of the story. Then Mr. Graceman continued. I was not surprised to find out when I arrived at the hotel that Mr. Varney was out. He had gone away for a few days, the clerk informed me politely, and he did not know where. The porter had carried his bag to the station, so I interviewed that individual and was fortunately able to discover his destination. I say fortunately, you may call it luck perhaps. He had sent a man with his bag to secure a corner seat in a smoking carriage while he bought his ticket, and then give the man a shilling for his services and jumped into a carriage. He had forgotten to get a paper, however, and called the porter back to give him a copper to buy one. In doing so, he pulled the ticket out of it, and it fell on the platform. The porter was an observant fellow and caught the name of the ticket. It was Hull. Thus you see the little things leading up the way it was. For that penny paper cost our mutual friend his liberty. Layman knew his friend too well to hurry him, but he fretted at the proximity of the narrative, so he nodded in appreciation and pretended to enjoy his cigar as he closed his eyes and waited patiently for his friend to continue. Hull, I thought, was still less attractive a place for Harlan's holiday, Mr. Graceman resumed, and I was so curious to find out what attraction drew him there that I followed at once. It was rather late when I arrived, so I left my investigation till the morning. Then I set out to try to trace the man. I was some time before I got on his tracks, and I discovered that he had taken the steamer on the previous day for Rotterdam. This was still a curious change of plans, so I followed him by that day's boat, and cut the long story short, with the aid of the authorities I soon discovered what he was up to. He had gone over to change the stolen notes, but we were too late to catch him before he had turned them into coin. The man had changed them, however, showed me the identical notes which he had changed for 10% commission. As I did not want any of the extradition trouble, I kept quiet and waited for the next steamer to sail for Hull. Just before the advertised time was started, arrived the man who came on board, and I knew that he was safe. When I arrived at Hull, I followed him to the hotel, and just then I called the chief inspector and charged him with the theft, and you know the rest. "You're splendid, simply splendid!" exclaimed the excited inspector when Graceman ended his story. Now I took it for granted that the notes were safe when the manager left, and never connected him with the notes at all. You underestimate your abilities, Layman, and overestimate mine. "That be bothered," replied the inspector. "There were the facts to see me and utilize, just the same as you saw them, but I could not see beyond my nose, while you read them correctly. The force lost a mighty leader when you took it to the law, sir." "Peru," replied Mr. Graceman, smiling at the officer's laudation. "You forget your own many successes." To say that all the bank was amazed at the turn of the events would be speaking mildly. Mr. Holmes had considered Frank Wendell's guilt as the next door to proved, and had hastened to offer the young cashier his sincere apologies for his doubts, which Frank met with his forced manner, and therefore after their personal esteem grew and flourished. Frank's uncle was also delighted to find out his nephew was freed from the stain on which he seemed to compass around him, and shortly afterwards he showed his regard for his kinsman by giving him his blessing when he proposed for his daughter Trixie. Shortly after, he was made the junior partner of the banking firm. Oh. Frank Graceman's voice really does get to me a little bit. Especially since it's Robert Graceman. Oh. So Scotland Yard spent the entire time looking into the wrong people. I love the fact that Holmes was one of the names of the bankers. Because thinking of Holmes, like I was saying earlier, the next one is from a series of stories from Arthur Conan Doyle. Let me see how long these are real quick. I might do ads first. Okay, 7 pages, 9 pages, and 7 pages again. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and do the ads now. Get them out of the way, and I'll probably be able to get at least 2 of these through before the end. So I will see everyone in a bit. As soon as I can find my Be Right Back screen. There it is. See you in a bit. Okay, I'm not sure why the cat camera is not showing up. That's weird. Is it showing on this one either? That is weird. My cat camera's not showing up. Ouch. I don't know why it's not showing up, though. It's not showing very well on my computer either, so... It's showing up and the color's horrible. I don't know, that's... Especially since I went ahead and moved a camera on it. Well, I brightened it. Give them a light. That's weird.
I think I just won my taxes.
Oh yeah?
I just switched from TurboTax to H&R Block. It was so easy.
You mean I don't have to go back through all this to switch?
Nope.
It's easy to switch from TurboTax to H&R Block.
But it is not showing up at all.
Live from New York!
It's the best sketch that's ever been made.
I gotta have more cowbell.
Writing's hard.
My first audition, I threw up. Yeah, I got fired. We gonna talk about it.
That's weird. Oh well. I'll have to work on that some other time. But welcome back. Here's my heater. As I said, the next couple of stories are going to be author Conan Doyle, without being Sherlock Holmes. Here's filter. Well, this would be warmer. But the series is called A Strange Studies from Life. And interesting because this is true stories with the names changed to protect the innocent, like Dragnet. But anyway, Strange Studies from Life by A. Conan Doyle. Story 1. The Holocaust of Manor Place. In the study of criminal psychology, one is forced to the conclusion that the most dangerous of all types of mind is that of the inordinately selfish man. He is a man who has lost his sense of proportion. His own will and his own interest have been blotted out from him to the duty which he owes to the community. Impulsiveness, jealousy, vindictiveness are the fruitful parents of crime, but the insanity of selfishness is the most dangerous and also the most unlovely of them all. Mr. Willoughby Pattern, the eternal type of all egotists, may have been an assuming and harmless character as long as things go well for him. But let him be thwarted, let the thing which he desires be withheld from him, and the most monstrous results may follow. Huxley has said that a man in his life is forever playing a game with an unseen opponent, who only makes a presence felt by extracting a penalty every time one makes a mistake in the game. The player who makes a mistake from selfishness may have... Good Lord, that was loud. Okay. Did not expect any text messages this time of night. So let me try the last few sentences. Oh, last sentence again. Huxley has said that a man in this game is forever playing Damn it. Huxley has said that a man in this life is forever playing a game with an unseen opponent, who only makes its presence felt by exacting a penalty every time one mistakes in the game. The player who makes the mistake of selfishness may have a terrible forfeit to pay, but the unaccountable thing in the rules is that some, who are only spectators of his game, may have to help him in the paying. Read the story of William Godfrey Youngman, and see how difficult it is to understand the rules under which the penalties are extracted. Learn also from it that selfishness is no harmless peccadillo, but that it is an evil root from which the most monstrous growths may spring. About 40 miles to the south of London, close to the rather passé watering place of Tunbridge Wells, there lies a little townlet of Wadhurst. It is situated on the borders of Sussex at the point which it is close to the confines of Kent. The country is a rich pastoral one, and the farmers are a flourishing race, for they are near enough to the metropolis to take advantage of its mighty appetite. Among these farmers there lived in the year of 1860 one Streeter, the master of a small homestead, and the father of a fair daughter, Mary Wells Streeter. Mary was a strong, robust girl, some 20 years of age, skilled in all country work, and with some knowledge also of the town, for she had friends up there, and above all she had one friend, a young man of 25, whom she had met upon one of her occasional visits, and who had admired her so that he had actually come down to Wadhurst after her, and had spent a night under her father's roof. The father had expressed no disapprobation of his suitor, and brisk, masterful young fellow, a little vague in his description of his own occupation and prospects, but an excellent fireside companion. And so it came about that the deep town-bred William Godfrey Youngman became engaged to the simple country-bred Mary Wells Streeter, William knowing all about Mary, but Mary very little about William. July the 29th of that year fell upon a Sunday, and Mary sat in the afternoon in the window of the farmhouse parlor, with her bundle of love letters upon her lap, reading them again and yet again. Outside was a little square of green lawn, fringed with the homely luxuriance of an English country garden, with high hollyhocks and huge nodding sunflowers, the bushes of fuchsia, and the fragrant clumps of sweet William. Through the open lattice came the faint, delicate scent of the lilac and the long, low droning of the bees. The farmer had lain down the plethoric sleep for the Sunday afternoon, and Mary had the room to herself. There were 15 love letters in all. Some shorter, some longer, some wholly delightful, some with scattered business allusions, which made her wrinkle her pretty brows. There was this matter of the insurance, for example, which had caused her lover so much anxiety until she settled it. No doubt he knew more of the world than she, but still it was strange that she, so young and so hale, should be asked again and again to prepare herself for death. Even in the flush of her love letters, those scattered words struck a chill to her heart. "Dearest girl," he had written, "I have filled up the papers now and took it to the life insurance office, so that they will write to Mr. James Bone today to get an answer on Sunday. So you can go to the office with me before 2 o'clock on Monday." And then again, only 2 days later, he had begun this letter. "You promised me faithfully over and over again, and I expect you to keep your promise, that you would be mine, and that your friends would not know it until we were married. But now, dearest Mary, if you will only let Mrs. James Bone write the insurance letter at once, and go with me to have your life insured Monday next morning." So ran the extracts from the letters, and they perplexed Mary as she read them. But it was all over now, and he should be mingling business no longer with his love, for she had yielded to his whim, and the insurance of £100 had been duly effected. It had cost her a quarterly payment of 10 sovereign for a day, but it had seemed to please him, and so she would think of it no more. There was a click at the garden gate, and looking up she saw the porter from the station coming up the path with a note in his hand. Seeing her at the window, he handed it in, and departed, silly, smiling, and curious messenger of Cupid in his corduroys and clumping boots. A messenger of a grimmer god than Cupid, but he had not known it. She had eagerly torn it open, and the antithesis was this message that she read. 16 Manor Place, Newington, SE. Saturday night, July 28th. My beloved Polly, I have posted one letter to you this afternoon, but I found that I shall have gone to Brighton tomorrow, as I have had a letter from there with what I wanted inside of it. So, my dear girl, I have quite settled my business now, and I am quite ready to see you now. Therefore, I send this letter to you. I will send this to London Bridge Station tomorrow morning by 6:30 o'clock, and get the guard to take it to Wadsworth Station, to give it to the porter there, who will take it to your place. I can only give the guard something, so you can give him the sum of the money who brings us a small sum. I shall expect to see you, my dear girl, on Monday morning by the first train. I will await your coming to London Bridge Station. I know the time the train arrives, 10:15 o'clock. I have promised to go to my uncle's tomorrow, so I cannot come down, but I will go with you home on Monday, and first thing Tuesday morning, and so return here Tuesday night, to be ready to go anywhere on Wednesday. But you expect that you will come up on Monday morning, when I shall be able to manage things as I expect to. Excuse more now, my dearest Mary. I shall go to bed to be up early tomorrow, and take this letter. Bring or burn all your letters, my dear girl. Do not forget. And with kind love and respects to all, I now sum up, awaiting to see you Monday morning at 10:15 o'clock. Believe me, ever your loving, affectionate, William Godfrey Yugman. A very pressing invitation this to a merry day in town, but there were certainly some curious phrases in it. What did he mean by saying that he would manage things as he expected to do? And why should she burn or bring the love letters? There, at least, she was determined to disobey this masterful suitor who had always expected in so authoritative a fashion that she would do this or do that. Her letters were much too precious to be disposed of in this off-handed fashion. She packed them back, 16 of them now, into a little tin box in which she kept her simple treasures, and then ran to meet her father, whose step she heard upon the stairs, to tell him of her invitation and the treat which awaited her tomorrow. At 10:15 next morning, William Godfrey Yugman was waiting upon the platform of London Bridge Station, to which the Wadsworth train, which was bringing his sweetheart up to town. No observer glanced down the straggling line of loiterers would have picked him out as the man whose name and odious fame would become, before another day had passed, be the household words to all the 3,000,000 dwellers of London. In person he was of the goodly height and build, but commonplace in his appearance, and with a character which was only saved through insignificance, through the colossal selfishness, tainted with insanity, which made him conceive that all things should bend before his need and will. So distorted was his outlook that it even seemed to him that if he wished people to be deceived, they must be deceived, and that the weakest device or excuse, if it came from him, would pass unquestioned. He had been a journeyman tailor, and his father was before him, but aspiring beyond this, he had sought and obtained a situation as footman to Dr. Duncan of Covent Gardens. Here he had served with credit for some time, but had finally resigned this post and had returned to his father's house, where for some time he had been living upon the hospitality of his hard-working parents. He had talked vaguely of going into farming, and it was doubtless his sort of experience at Wadsworth, with its sweet-smelling kine and Sussex breezes, which had put the notion into his Cockney head. But now the train rolls in, and there at the third-class window is Mary Streeter, with her pink country cheeks, the pinker at the sight of her waiting lover. He takes her bag, and they walk down the platform together amongst the crinolined women and baggy-trousered men whose pictures make the London of the dates more strange to us than that of the last century. He lives at Walsworth in South London, and a straw-strewn omnibus outside the station conveys them almost to the door. It was 11 o'clock when they arrived at Manor Place, where Youngman's family resided. The household arrangements at Manor Place were peculiar. The architect having not yet evolved the flat in England, the people had attained the same result in another fashion. The tenants of a two-storied house resided upon the ground floor, and then sublet his first and second floors to other families. Thus, in the present instance, Mr. James Bevan occupied the ground, Mr. and Mrs. Beard the second, and Youngman family Mr. and Mrs. Beard the first, and the Youngman family the second, of the various floors of number 16 Manor Place. The ceilings were thin, and the stairs were in common, so it may be imagined that each family took a lively interest in the doings of its neighbor. Thus Mr. and Mrs. Beard of the first floor were well aware that young Youngman had brought his sweetheart home, and were even able through half-closed doors to catch a glimpse of her, and to report that his manner towards her was affectionate. It was not a very large family to which he had introduced her. The father departed to his tailoring at 5 o'clock every morning, and returned at 10 at night. There remained only the mother, a kindly, anxious, hard-working woman, and two younger sons, aged 11 and 7. At 11 o'clock the boys were at school, and the mother alone. She welcomed her country visitor, eyeing her meanwhile, and summing her up as a mother would do when she first met the woman whom her son was likely to marry. They dined together, and thence the two set forth to see something of the sights of London. No record has been left of what the amusements were to which the singular couple turned. He with a savage, unrelenting purpose in his heart, she wondering at his abstract manner, and chattering country gossip at the shadow of death already gathering thickly over her. One little incident was survived. One Edward Spicer, a buff, outspoken publican who kept the Green Dragon in Bernardsby Street, knew Mary Streeter and her father. The couple called together at the inn, and Mary presented her lover. We have no means of knowing what repellent look mine host may have observed in the young man's face, or what malign trait he may have detected in his character, but he drew the girl aside and whispered that it was better for her to take a rope and hang herself in this skittle alley than to marry such a man as that. A warning which seems to have met the same fate as most other warnings received by maidens of their lovers. In the evening they went to the theatre together to see one of Macready's tragedies. How could she not know, she sat in the crowded pit, with her silent lover at her side, that her own tragedy was far grimmer than any upon the stage? It was 11 o'clock before they were back once more at Manor Place. The hard-working tailor had now returned, and the household all supped together. Then they had to be divided for the night between the two rooms, which were all the family possessed. The mother, Mary, and the boy of 7 occupied the front one. The father slept on his own board in the back one, and the bed beside him lay the young man and the boy of 11. So they settled down to sleep as a commonplace family as any in London, with little thought that within the day the attention of all the great city would be centered upon those two dingy rooms and upon the fates of their inmates. The father woke in the very early hours and saw in the dim light of dawn the tall figure of his son standing in white beside his bed. To some sleepy remark that he was stirring early, the youth muttered an excuse and lay down once more. At 5, the tailor rose to his endless task, and in 20 minutes past he went down the stair and closed the hall door behind him. So passed away the only witness, and all the remains of its conjecture and circumstantial evidence. No one will ever know the exact details of what occurred, and for the purpose of the chronicler it is as well, for such details will not bear to be too critically examined. The motives and mind of the murderer are the perennial interests of every student of human nature, but the vile record of his actual brutality may be allowed to pass away when the ends of justice have once been served by the recital. I've said that the floor under the Youngmans there lived a couple named Beard. At 5:30, a little after the time when the tailor had closed the hall door behind him, Mrs. Beard was disturbed by a sound which she took to be from the children running up and down playing. There was a light patter of feet on the floor above, but as she listened it struck her that there was something unusual in the romping at so early an hour, so she nudged her husband and asked him for his opinion. Then, as the two sat up in bed, straining their ears, there came from above a gasping cry and a dull, soft thud of a falling body. Beard sprang out of the bed and rushed upstairs until his head came upon the level of Youngman's landing. There he saw enough to send him shrieking down to Mr. Revan upon the ground floor. "For God's sake, come here! There's a murder!" he roared, fumbling with his fingers shaking at the handle of the landlord's bedroom. His summons did not find the landlord entirely unprepared. That ill-boding thud had been loud enough to reach his ears. He sprang palpitated from his bed, and the two men in their night-dresses ascended the creaking staircase, their frightened faces lit by the blaze of golden sunlight of a July morning. Again, they do not seem to have got farther than the point from which they could see the landing. That confused huddle of white-clad figures littered over the passage, with those glaring smears and blotches, were more than their nerves could stand. They could count 3 lying there, stark dead on the landing. And there was someone moving in the bedroom. It was coming towards him, with horrid-eyed eyes as they saw William Godfrey Youngman framed in the open doorway, his white nightdress brilliant with ghastly streaks, and his sleeve hanging torn over his hand. "Mr. Beard!" he cried when he saw the two bloodless faces upon the stairs. "For God's sake, fetch a surgeon!" "I believe there is some alive yet." Then, as they turned and ran down the stairs again, he called after them in a singular explanation to which he was afterwards adhered. "My mother has done all this," he cried. "She murdered my 2 brothers and my sweetheart, and I in self-defense believe that I have murdered her." The 2 men did not stop to discuss the question with him. They had both rushed to the rooms and huddled on some clothes, and then they ran out of the house in search of a surgeon and a policeman, leaving Youngman still standing on the stairs repeating his strange explanation. How sweet the morning air must have seemed to them when they had once cleared of the accursed house, and how the honest milkmen with their swinging tins must have stared at the 2 rushing of disheveled figures. But they had not far to go. John Varney, of the police department, and as solid and unimaginative as the law which he represents was standing on the street corner, and he came clumping back with reassuring slowness and dignity. "Oh, policeman, here is the sight! What shall we do?" cried Youngman, as he saw the glazed official hat coming up the stairs. Constable Varney is not shaken by that horrid cluster of death. His advice is practical and to the point. "Go and dress yourself," he said. "I struck my mother. It was out of self-defense," cried the other. "Would you not have done the same? It is the law." Constable Varney is not to be drawn into giving a legal opinion, but he is quite convinced that the best thing for Youngman to do in this case is to put on some clothes. And now a crowd had begun to gather in the street, and another policeman and inspector arrived. It was clear that, whether Youngman's story was correct or not, he was a self-confessed homicide, and that the law must hold a grip of him. But when a dagger-shaped knife, splintered by the force of repeated blows, was found upon the floor, and Youngman had to confess that it belonged to him, when also it was observed that ferocious strength and energy were needed to produce wounds inflicted, it became increasingly evident that, instead of being a mere victim of circumstances, this man was one of the criminals of the century. But all evidence must be circumstantial, for mother, sweetheart, brothers, and the mouths were all closed in one indiscriminate butchery. The horror and the apparent purposelessness of the deed roused public excitement and indignation to the highest pitch. The miserable sum for which poor Mary was insured appeared to be the sole motive of the crime. The prisoner's eagerness to have the business concluded, and his desire to have the letters destroyed in which he had urged it, forming the strongest evidence against him. At the same time, his calm assumption that things would be arranged as he wished them to be, and that Argus Insurance Office would pay over the sum of money to one who was neither husband nor relative of the deceased, pointed to an ignorance of the ways of the business, or to a belief in his own powers of managing, which in either case resembled insanity. When in addition to it came out to the trial that the family was sodden with lunacy upon both sides, that the wife's mother and husband's brother were in asylums, and that the husband's father had been in an asylum, but had become tolerably sensible before his death, it is doubtful whether the case should have been judged upon the medical rather than upon the criminal grounds. In these more scientific and more humanitarian days, it is perhaps doubtful whether Youngman would have been hanged, but there was never any doubt as to his fate in 1860. The trial came off at the Central Criminal Court on August 16th before Mr. Justice Williams. Few fresh details came out, save that the knife had been in the prisoner's possession at the time. He had exhibited it once in the bar, upon which a bystander, with a good British love of law and order, had remarked that it was not a fit knife for any man to carry. "Anybody," said Youngman in reply, "has the right to carry such a knife if he thinks proper in his own defense." Perhaps the objector did not realize how near he may have been to the point of getting its point between his ribs. Nothing serious against the prisoner's previous character came out of the trial, and he adhered steadfastly to his own account of the tragedy. In summing up, however, Justice Williams pointed out that if the prisoner's story were true, it meant that he had disarmed his mother and got possession of the knife. What necessity was it then and there for him to kill her, and why should he deal her repeated wounds? The arguments, and the fact that there were no stains upon the hands of the mother, prevailed the justice of the jury, and the sentence was duly passed upon the prisoner. The young man had shown an unmoved demeanor at the dock, and he gave signs of an irritable and occasionally of a violent temper in prison. His father had visited him, and the prisoner burst instantly into fierce reproaches against his treatment of his family. Reproaches for which there seemed to have been no justification. Another thing which appeared to have galled him to the quick was the remark of the publican, which was reached his ears at the trial, to the effect that Mary had better hang herself in the skittle-yard than marry such a man. His self-esteemed and strongest trait in his nature was the cruelty wounded upon his speech. "The only thing I wish," he cried furiously, "that I could get a hold of that man Spicer, for I would strike his head off." The unnatural and bloodthirsty character of the threat is characteristic of a homicidal maniac. "Do you suppose," he added, with the fine touch of vanity, "that a man of my determination and spirit would have heard these words used in the presence without striking the man who used them to the ground?" But in spite of the exhortation and persuasion, he carried his secret with him to the grave. He never varied from the story which he had probably concocted before the event. "Do not leave the world with a lie on your lips," said the chaplain as they walked to the scaffold. "Well, if I wanted to tell a lie, I would say that I did it," was his report. He hoped to the end that his serene self-belief in the story which would put forward could not fail inevitably to be accepted. Even on the scaffold he was on the alert for a reprieve. It was on the 4th of September, a little more than a month after commission of this crime, that he was led in the front of the Hosmonger jail to suffer his punishment. A concourse of 30,000 people, many of whom had waited all night, raised a beautiful howl at his appearance. It was remarked at the time that it was one of very few instances of capital punishment in which no sympathizer or philanthropist of any sort could be found to raise a single voice against the death penalty. The man died quietly and coolly. "Thank you, Mr. Jessup," said he to the chaplain, "for your kind greatness. See my brother and take my love to him, and all home." And so, with a snick of a bolt and the jar of a rope, ended one of the most sanguinary and also one of the most unaccountable incidents in English criminal annals. That the man was guilty seems to admit no doubt, and yet it is confessed that circumstantial evidence can never be absolutely convincing, and that it is only the critical student of such cases who realizes how often damning chain of evidence, nay, by some slight change, be made to bear an entirely different interpretation. Hey, Fred. Yeah, that is a lot of interesting subs. What are those? Demon Crunch? Okay. The chant. And thank you for the follow, Lisa. Crunchy pickle. Okay. I only got a lot of animated ones. I think I only got 5 or 6. I don't know. Let's see. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 8. Okay, I've got 8 animated ones. I need to time out stream loots. I don't do much on that one. Crunchy pickle, though. Yep, crunchy pickle. With 2 Y's. Ugh. Oh, come on. I gotta see if my cat cam works, because they're all 3 on it right now. Come on. Why is my cat camera not working? All 3 cats are asleep on it. I don't know why it's not working. Okay. Demon Otter. Okay. It makes me wonder, because I've got them... Hold on, let me see if I can add it on here. Group. Cat cam. Like, the group is still showing up. The text is still showing up, but the camera is just not. Ugh. Oh, I don't know why the cat cam's not working. Worked fine the other day. Oh yeah, I'll make sure they all get that bets. I might post it on Discord real quick. I'm on so many Discords. I can't keep track of all of them. I really am on way too many of these things. Let's see. Oh well. Yeah. Arthur Conan Doyle would write accounts of actual criminal cases. That's what that last story was. And I think I might be able to get one more. Let's see, how long is this next one? It's next one's 9 pages. Okay. Let's see, how well can I read this one? Strange Studies from Life by Arthur Conan Doyle. Number 2, The Love Affair of George Vincent Parker. The student of criminal annals will find, upon classifying these cases, that the 2 causes with which most are likely to incite the human being to the crime of murder are the lust of money and the black resentment of a disappointed love. Of these, the latter are both rarer and more interesting, for they are subtler in their inception and deeper in their psychology. The mind can find no possible sympathy with the brutal greed and selfishness which weighs the purse against life, but there is something more spiritual in the case of a man who is driven by jealousy and misery to a temporary madness of violence. To use the language of science, it is a passionate as distinguished from the instinctive criminal type. The two classes of the crime may be punishment by the same severity, but we feel that they are not equally sordid, and that none of us is capable of saying how he might act if his affections and his self-respect were suddenly and cruelly outraged. Even when we endorse the verdict, it is still possible to feel some shred of pity for the criminal. His offense has not been a result of a self-interested or cold-blooded plotting, but it has been the consequence, however monstrous and disproportionate, of a cause of which others were responsible. As an example of such a crime, I would recite the circumstances connected with George Vincent Parker, making some alteration in the names of persons and of places wherein it is possibility that pain might be inflicted by their disclosure. Nearly 40 years ago, there lived in one of our Midland cities a certain Mr. Parker, who did a considerable business as a commission agent. He was an excellent man of affairs, and during those progressive years which he intervened between the Crimean and Armenian wars, his fortune increased rapidly. He built himself a villa in a pleasant suburb outside of town, and being blessed with a charming and sympathetic wife, there was every prospect that evening of his days would be spent in happiness. The only trouble which he had contend with was his inability to understand the character of his only son, or to determine what plans he should make for his future. George Vincent Parker, the young man in question, was of the type which continually recurs and which verges always upon the tragic. By some trick of atavism, he had no love for the great city or its roaring life, none for the weary round of business, and no ambition to share the rewards which successful business brings. He had no sympathy with his father's works or his father's ways, and the life of the office was hateful to him. This aversion to work could not, however, be ascribed to viciousness or indolence. It was innate and constitutional. In the other directions, his mind was alert and receptive. He loved music and showed a remarkable aptitude for it. He was an excellent linguist and had some taste in painting. In a word, he was a man of artistic temperament, with all failings of nerve and of character with which that temperament implies. In London he would have met hundreds of the same type, and would have found a congenial occupation, making small incursions into literature and dabbling in criticism. Among the cotton brokers of the Midlands, his position was at the time an isolated one, and his father could only shake his head and pronounce him to be quite unfit to carry on the family business. He was gentle in his disposition, reserved with strangers, but very popular among his few friends. Once or twice it had been remarked that he was capable of considering bursts of passion when he thought himself ill-used. This is a type of man for whom the practical workers of the world have no affection, but it is one which invariably appeals to the feminine nature. There is a certain helplessness about it, and a naive appeal for sympathy to which a woman's heart rapidly responds, and it is one of the strongest, most vigorous women who is the first to answer the appeal. We do not know what other consolers this quiet dilettante may have found, but the details of one such connection have come down to us. It was at a musical evening at the house of a local doctor that he first met Miss Mary Groves. The doctor was her uncle, and she had come to town to visit him, but her life was spent in attendance upon her grandfather, who was a very virile old gentleman, whose 80 years did not prevent him from fulfilling all duties of a country gentleman, including those of magisterial bench. After the quiet of the secluded manor house, the girl, in the first flush of her youth and her beauty, enjoyed the life of the town, and seemed to have been particularly attracted by this refined young musician, whose appearance and manners suggested that touch of romance for which a young girl craves. He, on his side, was drawn to her by her country freshness, and by her sympathy which she showed for him. Before she returned to the manor house, friendship had grown into love, and the pair were engaged. But the engagement was not looked upon with much favor by either of the families concerned. Old Parker had died, and his widow was left with sufficient means to live in comfort, but it became more imperative than ever that some profession should be found for her son. His invincible repugnance to the business still stood in the way. On the other hand, the young lady came from a good stock, and her relations, headed by the old country squire, objected to her marriage to a penniless young man of curious tastes and character. So for 4 years the engagement dragged along, during which the lovers corresponded continually, but seldomly met. At the end of that time he was 25 and she was 23, but the prospect of their union seemed as remote as ever. At last the prayers of her relatives overcame her consistency, and she took steps to break the tie which held them together. This she endeavored to do by a change in tone of her letters, and by ominous passages to prepare him for the coming blow. On August 12th of 18, she wrote that she had met a clergyman who was the most delightful man she had ever met in her life. "He has been staying with us," she said, "and grandfather thought that he would do just suit me, and that should do not." This passage, in spite of her few lukewarm words of reassurance, disturbed young Vincent Parker exceedingly. His mother testified afterwards to the extreme depression into which he was thrown, which was the less remarkable as he was a man who suffered from continuous low spirits, and who always took the darkest view upon every subject. Another letter reached him the next day, which was more decided in its tone. "I have a good deal to say to you, and it may be better to be said at once," she said. "My grandfather has found out about our correspondence, and is wild that there should be any obstacle to the match between the clergyman and me. I want you to release me, that I may have it to say that I am free. Don't take this too hardly, in pity for me. I shall not marry if I can help it." This second letter had an overpowering effect. His state was such that his mother had to ask a family friend to sit up with him all night. He paced up and down in an extreme state of nervous excitement, bursting constantly into tears. When he lay down, his hands and feet twitched convulsively. Morphia was administered, but without effect. He refused all food. He had the utmost difficulty in answering the letter, and when he did so the next day, it was with the help of a friend who had stayed with him all night. His answer was reasonable, and also affectionate. "My dearest Mary," he said, "dearest, you will always beat me. To say that I am not terribly cut up would be a lie. But at any rate, you know that I am not the man to stand in your way. I answer nothing to your last letter except that I wish to hear from your own lips what your wishes are, and I will then accede to them. You know me too well to think that I would give way to any unnecessary nonsense or sentimentalism. Before I leave England, I wish to see you once again, and for the last time, though God knows what misery it gives me to say so. You will admit that my desire to see you is but natural. Say her next where we will meet. Ever, dearest Mary, your affectionate George." Next day he wrote another letter in which he again implored her to give him an appointment, saying that any place between their house and Stanwell, the nearest village, would do. "I am ill and thoroughly upset, and I do not wonder that you are," said he. "We shall both be happier in mind, if as well as in body, as after this last interview. I shall be at your appointment. Court. Always your affectionate George." There seems to be an answer in the letter actually making an appointment, for he wrote again upon Wednesday, the 19th. "My dear Mary," said he, I will only say here that I will arrive by the train you mentioned, and that I hope, dear Mary, that you will not bother yourself unnecessarily about all this so far as I am concerned. For my own peace of mind, I wish to see you, which I hope you won't think selfish. Do rest. I only repeat what I have already said. I have but to hear from you what your wishes are, and they shall be complied with. I have sufficient savoir-faire to make not a bother that can help you. I don't let me be the cause of any row between you and your grandpa. If you like to call it the inn, I will not stir until you come, but I leave this to your judgment. As Professor Owen would reconstruct an entire animal out of a single bone, so from this one little letter the man stands flagrantly revealed. The scraps of French, the self-conscious allusion to his own savoir-faire, the florid assurances which mean nothing, they are all so many strokes in a subtle self-portrait. Miss Groves had already repented the appointment which she had given him. There may have been some traits in this eccentric lover whom she had abandoned which recurred to her memory and warned her not to trust herself in his power. "My dear George," she wrote, and her letter must have been crossed in that first line. "I write this in the greatest haste to tell you not to come on my account. I leave here today and can't tell you where I can or shall be back. I do not wish to see you if it possibly can be avoided, and indeed there will be no chance now. So we had best end the stage of suspense at once and say good-bye without seeing each other. I feel sure that I cannot stand the meeting. If you write once more within the next 3 days, I shall get it, but not later than that time without this being seen, for my letters are strictly watched, and even opened. Yours, Mary." This letter seems to have been brought by any vague schemes which may have been already forming in the young man's mind, to an immediate end. If he had only 3 days in which he might see her, he could not afford to waste any time. On the same day he went to the country town, but as it was late as he did not go to the Standwell, which was her station. The waiters in the Midland Hotel noticed his curious demeanor and vacant eye. He wandered about the coffee room, muttering to himself, and although he ordered chops and tea, he swallowed nothing but some brandy and soda. Next morning, August 21st, he took a ticket to Standwell and arrived there at 11:30. From Standwell Station to the Manor House, at which Miss Groves resided, with an old squire, is 2 miles. There is an inn-house close to the station called the Bull's Head. Vincent Parker called there and ordered some brandy. Then he asked whether a note had been left for him there, and seemed much disturbed upon hearing that there was none. Then, the time being about 12:15, he went off in the direction of the Manor House. About 2 miles upon either side of the Manor House, and 4 miles from the Bull's Head Inn, there was a thriving grammar school, the headmaster of which was a friend of the Groves family, and had some slight acquaintance with Vincent Parker. The young man thought, therefore, that this would be the best place for him to apply for information, and arrived at the school at 1:30. The headmaster was no doubt considerably astonished by the appearance of this disheveled and brandy-smelling visitor, but he answered his questions with discretion and courtesy. "I've called upon you," said Parker, "as a friend of Miss Groves, and I suppose you know that there is an engagement between us." "I understood that there was an engagement, and that it has been broken off," said the master. "Yes," Parker answered. "She has written to me to break off the engagement and declines to see me. I want to know how matters stand." "Anything I may know," said the master, "is in confidence, so I cannot tell you." "I'll find it out sooner or later," said Parker, and then he asked who the clergyman was who had been staying at the Manor House. The master acknowledged that there had been one, but refused to give a name. Parker then asked whether Miss Groves was in the manor house, and any coercion was being used on her. The other answered that she was at the manor house, and that no coercion was being used. "Sooner or later I must see her," said Parker. "I have written to release her from her engagement, but I must hear from her own lips that she gives me up. She is of age, and must please herself. I know that I am not a good match, but I do not wish to stand in her way." The master then remarked that it was time for school, but he should be free again at 4:30 if Parker had anything more to say to him, and Parker left, promising to return. It is not known how he spent the next few hours, but he may have found some country inn in which he had obtained a luncheon. At 4:30 he was back at the school and asked the master for advice as how to act. The master suggested that it was the best course was to write a note to Miss Groves and make an appointment with her the next morning. "If you were to call at the house, perhaps Miss Groves would see you," said his sympathetic and most studious manner. "I will do so and get it off my mind," said Vincent Parker. It was about 5 o'clock when he left the school, his manner at the time which seemed calm and collected. It was 40 minutes later that the discarded lover arrived at the house of his sweetheart. He knocked at the door and asked for Miss Groves. She had probably seen him as he came down the drive, for she met him at the drawing-room door as he came in, and she invited him to come with her into the garden. Her heart was in her mouth, no doubt, lest her grandfather should see him and the scene ensue. It was safer to have him in the garden than in the house. They walked out, therefore, and half an hour later they were seen chatting quietly upon one of the benches. A little afterward the maid went out and told Miss Groves that tea was ready. She came in alone, and it was suggestive of the views taken by the grandfather that there seems to have been no question about Parker coming in also for tea. She came out again in the garden and sat for a long time with the young man, after which they seemed to have set off together for a stroll down the country lanes. What passed during that walk, what recriminations upon his part, what retorts upon hers, will never be known. They were only once seen in the course of it. At about 8:30, a laborer coming up the long lane which led from the high road to the manor house saw a man and a woman walking together. As he passed them, he recognized in the dusk that the lady was Mrs. Groves, the granddaughter of the squire. When he looked back, he saw that they had stopped and were standing face to face conversing. A very short time after the Reuben Conway, a workman, was passed down this lane when he heard a low sound of moaning. He stood listening, and in the silence of the country evening, he became aware that the ominous sound was drawing nearer to him. A wall flanked one side of the lane, and as he was staring about him, he caught something moving down the back shadow of the side. For a moment it must have seemed to him as some wounded animal, but as he approached, he saw the astonishment that it was a woman who was slowly stumbling along, guiding and supporting herself by the hand against the wall. With a cry of horror, he found himself looking into the face of Miss Groves, glimmering white through the darkness. "Take me home," she whispered. "Take me home. The gentleman down there has been murdering me." A horrified laborer put his arms around her and carried her for about 20 yards towards home. "Can you see anyone coming down the lane?" she asked when he stopped for breath. He looked, and through the dark tunnel of trees he saw a black figure moving slowly behind them. The laborer waited, still propping up the girl's head, until young Parker overtook them. "Who has been murdering Miss Groves?" asked Reuben Conway. "I've stabbed her," said Parker with the utmost coolness. "Well, then, you had best help me up to carry her to the house," said the laborer. So down the dark lane moved that singular possession, the rustic and her lover, with the body of a dying girl between them. "Poor Mary," Parker replied. "Poor Mary, you should not have proved false to me." When they got as far as the lodge gate, Parker suggested that Reuben Conway should run and get something that might staunch the bleeding. He went, leaving these tragic lovers together for the last time. When he returned, he found Parker holding something to her throat. "Is she living?" he asked. "She is," said Parker. "Oh, take me home," wailed the poor girl. A little farther upon their dolorous journey, they met two farmers, who helped them. "Who has done this?" asked one of them. "He knows, and I know," said Parker gloomily. "I am the man who has done this, and I shall be hanged for it. I have done it, and there's no question about that at all." These replies never seemed to have brought insult or invective upon his head, for everyone appears to have been silenced by the overwhelming tragedy of the situation. "I'm dying," gasped poor Mary, and they were the last words which she ever said. Inside the hall gates, they met a poor old squire running wildly up on some vague rumor of disaster. The bearers stopped as it saw the white hair gleaming through the darkness. "What is amiss?" he cried. Parker said calmly, "It is your granddaughter, Mary, murdered." "Who did it?" shrieked the old man. "I did it." "Who are you?" he cried. "My name is Vincent Parker." "Why did you do it?" "She deceived me, and the woman who deserves me must die." The calm concentration of his manner seems to have silenced all reproaches. "I told her I would kill her," he said, as they entered the house together. "She knew my temper." The body was carried into the kitchen and laid upon the table. In the meantime, Parker had followed the bewildered and heartbroken old man into the drawing room, and holding out a handful of things, including his watch and some money, he asked him if he would take care of them. The squire angrily refused. He then took 2 bundles of her letters out of his pocket, and all that was left of their miserable love story. "Will you take these?" he said. "You may read them, burn them, do what you like to them. I don't wish them to be brought into court." The grandfather took the letters, and they were duly burned. And now the doctor and the policeman and the twin attendants upon the violence came hurrying down the avenue. Poor Mary was dead upon the kitchen table, and 3 great wounds upon her throat. How, with a severed cartilage, she would have come so far, lived so long, is one of the marvels of the case. To the policeman, he had no trouble in looking for his prisoner. As he entered the room, Parker walked towards him and said that he wished to give himself up for murdering a young lady. When he asked if he was aware of the nature of the charge, he said, "Yes, quite so, and I will go with you quietly. Only let me see her first." "What have you done with the knife?" asked the policeman. Parker produced it from his pocket, a very ordinary one with a clasp blade. It is remarkable that the other 2 penknives were afterwards frowned upon him. They took him into the kitchen, and he looked at the victim. "I'm far happier now that I have done it than before, and I hope that she is," he said. This is a record of the murder of Mary Groves by Vincent Parker, a crime characterized by all inconsequence and grim alertness which distinguish fact from fiction. In fiction, we make people say and do what we should conceive them to be likely to say and do. But in fact, they say and do what no one would ever conceive to be likely. That those letters should be a prelude to murder, or that the murderer of the criminal should endeavor to staunch the wounds of his victim, or to hold such a conversation as described with the old squire, is what no human invention would hazard. One finds it is very difficult in reading the letters and weighing the facts to suppose that Vincent Parker came out that day and performed the intention of killing his former sweetheart. But whether the dreadful idea was always there, or whether it came in some mad flash of passion provoked by their conversation, is what we shall never know. It is certain that she could not have seen anything dangerous in him in the very instant of the crime, or she would have certainly have appealed to the laborer who passed them in the lane. In case, which excited the utmost interest through the length and breadth of England, was tried before Baron Martin at the next assizes. There was no need to prove the guilt of the prisoner, since he openly gloried in it, but the whole question turned upon his sanity, and led to some curious compilations which have caused the whole law upon the point to be reformed. That his relations were called to show the madness of rampant in his family, and that out of 10 cousins, 5 were insane. His mother appeared in the witness box contending the dreadful vehemence that her son was mad, and that her own marriage had been objected to on the grounds of madness latent on her blood. All the witnesses agreed that the prisoner was not an ill-tempered man, but sensitive, gentle, and accomplished, with a tendency to melancholy. The prison chaplain affirmed that he had held conversations with Parker, and that his moral perception seemed to be so entirely wanting that he hardly knew right from wrong. 2 specialists in lunacy examined him, and said that they were of the opinion that he was unsound mind. An opinion was based upon the fact that the prisoner declared that he could see that he had done any wrong. Miss Groves was promised to me, he said, and therefore she is mine. I could do what I liked with her. Nothing short of a miracle will alter my convictions. The doctor attempted to argue with him. Suppose anyone took a picture from you. What steps would you take to recover it? He asked. I should demand restitution, he said. If not, I should take the thief's life without compunction. The doctor pointed out that the law was there to be appealed to, but Parker answered that he had been born into a world without being consulted, and therefore he recognized the right of no man to judge him. The doctor's conclusion was that the moral sense was more vitiated than any case he had seen before. That this constitutes madness would, however, be a dangerous doctrine to urge, since it means that if the man were only wicked enough, he would be screened from the punishment of his wickedness. Baron Martin summed up in a common-sense manner. He declared that the world was full of eccentric people, and that to grant them all the immunity of madness would be a public danger. To be mad within the meaning of the law of a criminal should be in such a state that it not know that he has committed a crime, nor incurred punishment. Now it was clear that Parker did know this, since he had talked of being hanged. The Baron accordingly accepted the jury's finding of guilty, and sentenced the prisoner to death. There the matter might very well have ended, were it not for the Baron Martin's conscientious scruples. His own ruling had been admirable, but the testimony of the mad doctors weighed heavily upon him, and his conscience was uneasy at a mere possibility that a man who was not answerable for his actions should lose his life through his decision. It is probable that the thought kept him awake at night, for next morning he wrote the Secretary of State and told him that he shrank from the decision of such a case. The Secretary of State, having carefully read the evidence and the judge's remarks, was about to confirm the decision of the letter, when, upon the very eve of the execution, there came a report from the jail visitors, perfectly untrained observers that Parker was showing undoubtable signs of madness. This being to the Secretary of State had no choice but to postpone the execution and to appoint a commission of 4 eminent alienists to report upon the condition of the prisoner. These 4 reported unanimously that he was perfectly sane. It is an unwritten law, however, that a prisoner once reprieved is never executed. So Vincent Parker's sentence was commuted to penal servitude for life, a decision which satisfied, upon the whole, the conscience of the public. All right then. Well, I don't have any more snoozes, so the ads are going to have to run. But if you're not here, thank you all for coming in. I hope you come in tomorrow night for some fairy tales, and hopefully a lot less murder. But considering the stories from last week, I can't guarantee that. But anyway, I hope you all have a good night. And I'll try to find someone to raid.
In the quiet of the evening, where shadows softly play, a fairy tale wolf sheds his skin, gently drifting away, with a twinkle in his eye and a heart full of dreams. He waits for the Friday night glow, where the magic redeems. Oh, the wolf in the moonlight, he's found his true call, reading tales of wonder for one and for all. In a world of stars dancing, his spirit takes flight, with stories of beauty under the starlit night. He picks up a book, the pages worn and wise, every line a whisper under the vast skies, from far off lands where the wild things roam, to enchanted forests where the heart